Hello, hi everyone. Welcome back to Woo Can Cook. My name is Wesley, and this is a show where we are slowly cooking our way through all of the food from my childhood. Today we'll be diving back into our series dedicated to Chinese American hack recipes with a shot at the PF Chang's pepper steak. But before we do that though, today we are also celebrating our 100th recipe. Yes, that's right y'all. We have officially made 100 of these videos and somehow all of you are still here watching them, which is wild and humbling and just such an honor to get to make food for you all every week. So before we do anything else, I just wanted to start by saying thank you all from the bottom of my heart for watching and sharing these recipe videos. These short videos, all of the music, live streams, thank you to everyone who has come to a pop-up, all of it. Just thank you. I don't know how this happened or how we got here, but here we are though. Anyway, back to our recipe. Today we're going to be taking a shot at reproducing the PF Chang's pepper steak, which seemed fitting for our 100th recipe because it is more or less just their Mongolian beef with a few extra steps. And for those who have been following along, our PF Chang's Mongolian beef recipe also happens to be the most watched video on this channel by a pretty wide margin, which is not a distinction that I ever thought I would ever make about any YouTube video that I'd ever make. Now, like I mentioned, as far as I can tell, the PF Chang's pepper steak is pretty much their Mongolian beef with a few extra veggies added and a significant amount of black pepper used as a garnish. This means that for our version today, I'm going to be borrowing a number of elements from our Mongolian beef recipe, including the cornstarch coating and sear to our steak, as well as the dark soy sauce base too. In addition though, I'm also going to include a few small changes / improvements. Let's just say we're going to add a few extra steps that I wish I had taken in that original Mongolian beef recipe, which would have elevated the final dish quite a bit. Mainly that's going to be the inclusion of a bit of baking powder or baking soda to help tenderize our flank steak, as well as a few heat elements which will really open up the sweetness of our dark soy sauce nicely. Then we're going to combine all of this with the crispy piece of flank steak that I think we perfected in that original Mongolian beef recipe for a wonderfully rich, crispy, peppery, and tender beef stir-fry. Okay, so let's get into it.
Just try and think of nice things like let me see nice things. Daffodils, green meadows, raindrops on roses, whiskers on kittens, cream-colored ponies and
Alright, so diving right in, I'm kicking things off with our steak here first, as we're going to need a little bit of extra time for this bit today. I'm going with some flank steak here, which is also what the PF Chang's menu description calls for as well. For those who have been following though, we also A/B tested flank steak versus top cut Angus sirloin in our Mongolian beef recipe and found the results to be more or less the same. In either case though, both cuts of beef are fairly tough to bite into, so we're going to take some extra steps today to help create a more tender piece of beef. To start, I'm being very careful here to make as many cuts against the grain as possible, which is going to make for a nicer bite later on. In addition, I'm also doing my absolute best to trim off as much of this connective tissue as I can, which again is going to be chewy to bite into as well. Then finally, we're chopping this up into 1-inch pieces before combining with half a teaspoon of baking powder or baking soda, either will work, dissolved in water. A quick 15-minute soak here will work some food science magic to help keep our proteins from bonding during the sear, once again resulting in an even more tender piece of beef. 15 minutes later, I'm draining off any excess baking powder that's left behind, then working in our marinade next. This is 4 tablespoons of soy sauce to start, followed by 2 tablespoons each of sesame oil and Shaoxing wine. Then we're rounding this out with some black pepper and setting this aside to marinate for 30 minutes. 30 minutes later, I'm measuring out half a cup of cornstarch, then breaking out some wet hand, dry hand techniques so that we may dredge our marinated steak in cornstarch. For those following along, at this point this should look very similar to our Mongolian beef because we're essentially making Mongolian beef right now. Our cornstarch is going to crisp up in the sear later on for some nice crispy edges to our steak, while also preventing the beef from cooking too quickly on its exterior surface, once again helping to create an even more tender and juicy piece of steak. Moving on to my veggies, first up, as you might expect, are our aromatics. This is 4 cloves of crushed and minced garlic, followed by 1 inch or about 1 tablespoon of finely minced ginger. Then next up are my bell peppers. Now iconically, PF Chang's pepper steak includes both red and green bell peppers, which is gonna look really pretty on the plate. But if you're not a stickler about this bit though, feel free to just use one red bell pepper instead of half of one of each because, as we all know, green bell peppers are gross. But anyway, I'm rounding this out with half of a medium white onion that has been large diced with the root end still attached for a consistent chop, and we're moving on to our sauce next. Going in here first is 4 tablespoons of soy sauce, followed by our big umami drivers for today. This is 1 tablespoon each of dark soy sauce, black vinegar, and oyster sauce. Then rounding this all out is what I think was the biggest element missing from our earlier Mongolian beef recipe, which is a couple of big heat-driving elements to bring everything to life. This is 1 tablespoon of Chinese doubanjiang, followed by 2 tablespoons of chili crisp oil that I'm adding here to open everything up. I'm mixing this all up to combine, and then in a separate bowl, I'm dissolving 2 tablespoons of cornstarch in water for our cornstarch slurry to thicken up our sauce later on, and we're heading over to the stove. Over on the stove, I have my wok heating up as hot as possible, and then I'm adding 4 tablespoons of peanut oil and, as always, long yao for that nice non-stick surface. Then up first here, we're circling back to our steak, which I'm adding 1 piece at a time, flat side down, and searing for 2.5 minutes before flipping and searing for an additional 1 minute. Those following along with this series will recall the beautiful disaster piece that resulted in our first attempt at Mongolian beef, where I did not do this sear and just dumped everything in for a stir fry. Don't forget that that is half a cup of cornstarch coating your steak right now, so if you don't properly sear it to the steak here, that stuff is gonna come off into your sauce base and you'll have a lovely Mongolian beef custard for dinner. Gross. Anyway, I'm repeating this with my remaining steak. This took me 3 batches altogether for me. And then for our third and final update to our Mongolian beef, I'm using a little bit of European cooking technique that for whatever reason I never see come up in wok cooking, even though it absolutely should. I'm deglazing this reserved fond here with my sauce element plus about a 1/4 cup of water so that we may incorporate all of this wonderful beef fat and juice into our sauce. Then I'm letting this go for about a minute until fully incorporated, and then removing from heat and cleaning out my wok one more time so that we may finish up with our stir fry next. Once my wok is nice and cleaned out, I'm reheating and then adding another 4 tablespoons of peanut oil and giving 1 more long yao. Then going in here first is my garlic and ginger, which we're blooming for about 15 seconds until nice and fragrant. Then up next are my bell peppers, which I'm giving a solid 2-minute head start to because these are going to be a lot more dense than our onions, which we're adding in next. Then I'm giving these onions a very brief 1-minute toss on heat before adding my steak back to the wok here, followed by my sauce element and our cornstarch slurry to start thickening things up. As always, remember that your cornstarch slurry needs to go right into the center of the wok, not around the sides, or else it's going to start frying against the wok surface. Finally, I'm finishing everything off with a bit more black pepper, or a lot more black pepper, it's in the name after all, and we're ready to eat. Okay, so for those following along, I know that this flank steak might certainly look very similar to our earlier Mongolian beef attempt, but I do think that the addition of that baking powder silk made a significant difference in helping to tenderize that tough cut of flank steak. This, of course, is not the first time that this cooking technique has come up on this channel, but it is particularly useful in this scenario though, since we are searing the living daylight out of that steak, which can turn into a tough bite if we're not careful. Rounding this out, I personally have never been a huge fan of stir fries without veggies in it like a typical Mongolian beef is. It just always feels a little bit off balance to my taste, so I also thought that the extra veggies here are a nice addition as well, even if green bell peppers are awful. Finally, the last bit that I'll mention is that even though I personally have never really come across black pepper in any kind of traditional Chinese wok cooking, I actually thought that this was a really intuitive addition that made a lot of logical sense here, since obviously we put black pepper on steak all of the time, so I 100% stand by the absolutely absurd amount of black pepper that I added here today. Okay, so that's it everyone. I hope you enjoyed this and I hope you give this one a shot. For those who are new to the channel, this one is part of a larger series that we've been doing that's dedicated to reproducing a lot of classic Chinese American dishes, including a whole bunch of other stuff from the PF Chang's menu, so definitely check out that series next if you haven't yet, because there's a lot of these. For the Bay Area locals, the Wu Can Cook pop-up is back at line 51 in Oakland tonight, so come by and say hi if you can. More about that at wucancook.com/eats. Finally, once again, thank you all so much for tuning in and watching these videos every week. It just means the world to me that there are so many folks learning how to cook all of these foods from my childhood, and I'm just so excited to share some more stuff with you all. See you soon.